What would you do if the only thing your father left you in the world was a single-room cabin at the far edge of a snowbound valley, stocked to the rafters with flour, lamp oil, and firewood, with a second bed made up neat as a church pew for a person you had never met? That is what happened to Mary Tanner, 22 years old, when the lawyer in Pine Hollow read out the will and pressed a cold iron key into her palm. But what waited inside that cabin, and what the drifts would slowly uncover about the man she thought she knew, would rewrite every memory she had of him. Settle in. Pull the lamp a little closer. This one asks to be listened to, slow. The stage road ended at Pine Hollow, the way most things ended on that stretch of country, without ceremony, in a rut of half-frozen mud, beside a plank church with its bell rope frayed to a tassel. Mary Tanner stepped down from the coach with one carpetbag in her hand and her father's folded letter in the pocket of her wool coat, and she stood a long moment on the boards of the depot porch before she remembered to breathe. The wind coming down off the ridge tasted of pine sap and iron. She had ridden 2 days to get here. She felt each of them settled in the small of her back. She was a plain girl, in the way plain was meant on the frontier. Not homely, but unornamented, quiet-boned, brown hair braided down into a single rope beneath a gray headscarf, cheeks reddened by the cold, eyes the color of creek water in shadow. Her dress was dark wool, the color of wet bark, the hem let down twice already and mended twice more. Her boots had been her mother's before her, and her mother had been dead 6 years, and the leather had learned to fit her without complaint. Around her shoulders she wore a shawl the shade of ash, pinned at the throat with a small tin brooch shaped like a wheat sheaf. That brooch had been the last thing her father gave her, 3 Christmases back. She had not taken it off since the telegram came. The telegram had come on a Tuesday. She remembered because she had been kneading bread for the boarding house where she worked, and the flour on her hands had left a pale ghost on the yellow paper when she took it. 6 words. Your father passed peaceful this morning, signed by a doctor she had never heard of, in a town she had never seen. She had set the bread aside to rise. She had walked out to the alley and stood by the woodpile until she could feel her feet again. Then she had gone back inside and finished the loaves, because the boarders would want their supper, and grief on the frontier did not excuse a woman from her hands. Now she stood in the town where he had died, and the town was smaller than she had pictured. Pine Hollow was one main street of unpainted plank buildings that had gone the color of old horn, a mercantile with a bull skull nailed over the door, a livery with the letters half worn off, a saloon leaning slightly north as if it had grown tired listening for its own footsteps, a blacksmith down at the far end where the ring of hammer on anvil rose and fell like a slow pulse. Behind it all the mountains climbed straight up into a sky the color of skimmed milk, and somewhere up in those folds, according to the letter in her pocket, was the cabin. A man in a canvas coat crossed the street toward her, hat pulled low, a leather satchel under his arm. He was maybe 50, gray at the temples, with the careful gentleness that lawyers on the frontier learned or did not survive. Miss Tanner, he said. Yes. I am Alden Hoke. I wrote you. I remember. He nodded once. He did not offer his hand, and she was grateful for it, because her fingers had gone stiff inside her mittens, and she did not trust them to grip. He tipped his head toward the mercantile. Coffee first, he said. Then business. She followed him across the mud. 2 men on the boardwalk stepped aside and touched their brims and looked at her a beat too long, the way people looked at a mourner when the story of the death was still fresh in the town's mouth. She kept her eyes on the back of Alden Hoke's coat. Inside the mercantile the air was warm and smelled of coffee grounds and molasses and wet wool. A stove the size of a butter churn glowed red at the middle of the room. A woman behind the counter with a face like a folded map poured them each a tin cup without asking, and Alden Hoke sat down across from Mary at a small table by the window and slid a leather folio out of his satchel. He waited until she had drunk half the coffee before he opened it. Your father, he said, left 3 things in this world when he passed: a saddle, a tin box of letters. and a cabin, about 11 miles up the North Fork, at the head of the valley they call Wheat Ear Draw. A cabin? Yes. Not the ranch. Alden Hoke's mouth pulled tight at one corner. The ranch was lost 2 winters ago, Miss Tanner. Bank in Cheyenne took it in the spring. I am sorry. I thought perhaps he had told you. She held the tin cup with both hands. The coffee had gone the color of riverstone at the bottom. 2 winters ago. 2 winters ago her father had written her a letter about a new colt he was breaking, and how the north pasture had come in thick with blue stem, and how he would send for her when the house was ready. She had believed him. She had gone on believing him letter after letter, each one thinner than the last, each one postmarked a different way station, until the letters stopped coming altogether last spring, and she had told herself only that the roads were bad. No, she said, he did not tell me. Alden Hoke looked down at the folio. He was a kind man, she could see that now, and kindness was making the job harder for him rather than easier. The cabin is yours free and clear, he said. He built it himself, deeded it in your name a year and a half back, paid the tax on it through next fall. There is no debt on it, Miss Tanner, not a nickel. And nothing else. The saddle, the letters, that is all. She nodded. She had not expected more. She had learned, in the 6 years since her mother died, not to expect. Still, something in her chest had gone hollow at the word cabin, and she could not tell yet whether the hollow was grief or something else, something that had been waiting under the grief the way a stone waits under snow. How did he die? She said. Alden Hoke folded his hands on the folio. Quiet, he said, in his sleep. Doc Reeve rode out and found him at the cabin. He had been alone up there through most of the fall, laying in stores. He was not sick, so far as anyone knew. His heart, the doc thinks, just tired. Laying in stores. Yes, ma'am. Flour, salt, beans, oil for the lamps, cord after cord of firewood, split and stacked. More than a man alone would need for one winter. Alden Hoke paused. He seemed to weigh whether to say the next part. The doc mentioned, and I am only passing it along, Miss Tanner, that there is a second bed in the cabin, made up, ready. He does not know for who. Your father never said. She sat very still. Outside the window a boy went by driving a mule that would not be driven, and the boy's small shouts came muffled through the glass, and the wood in the stove popped once, sharp. A second bed, made up, ready. I did not know he was building a cabin, she said finally. Her voice sounded thin to her, as if it had traveled a long way to get out. I did not know he was living in one. I do not think he wanted you to know until it was finished, Alden Hoke said. That was the sense I had of him. He came into my office last November, in a snow, with the deed papers already filled out in his own hand. He wanted your name on it. He was— Alden Hoke searched for the word. He was particular. He wanted it done right. Mary looked down at her tin brooch, the wheat sheaf. Her father had bought it off a peddler at a crossroads once and given it to her wrapped in a page torn out of an almanac. She remembered the almanac page had been the one with the phases of the moon on it. She remembered thinking, at the time, that this was very like him, to wrap a gift in a page about time. I would like to see it, she said. Alden Hoke nodded as if he had expected nothing else. There is a man at the livery, Ord Beeman. He rents a horse gentle enough for a lady, and he knows the trail up Wheat Ear. You should not go alone the first time. The weather is turning, and the trail forks twice in ways that are not obvious to a stranger. Tomorrow, then? Tomorrow. He hesitated. Miss Tanner, there will be talk in town. There has been talk. Your father kept to himself, and men who keep to themselves collect stories they did not ask for. I would ask you to weigh what you hear against what you knew of him. What kind of talk? Alden Hoke shook his head once, like a horse shaking off a fly. Nothing worth repeating in this room, only weigh it. That is all I ask. She said she would. She rose. He rose with her and settled her carpetbag onto her shoulder as gently as if it were an infant, and he walked her across the street to the boarding house where a room had been kept for her, and he told her he would come by in the morning with the tin box of letters and the deed papers signed. Then he touched the brim of his hat and went off down the boardwalk, and Mary Tanner stood alone for a moment on the porch of the boarding house and watched the wind lift a curl of loose shingle on the church roof across the way and lay it back down again, gentle as a hand. The mountains behind the town had gone dark blue in the failing light. Somewhere up in those folds was a cabin she had never seen, that her father had built with his own hands and had filled with flour and oil and firewood past what one man could burn, and had set a second bed in, made up neat, waiting, she did not know yet for whom. She only knew, standing there on the boarding-house porch with the tin brooch cold against her throat and her father's last letter folded small in her pocket, that she had not come all this way to turn around, and that whatever was in that cabin at the head of Wheat Ear Draw was hers to walk into now, alone, whether she was ready or not. Above the ridge, the first star of the evening opened its small pale eye and looked down at the town, and Mary Tanner went inside to sit by a stranger's stove and wait for morning. Morning came the way mornings come to mountain towns in late season, without ceremony and without warmth. Mary woke before the light in a narrow iron bed under a quilt that smelled faintly of cedar. For a long moment she did not remember where she was. Then the cold plank floor under her bare feet reminded her, and the thin blue window, and the sound downstairs of a stove being fed, and she remembered all of it at once, as if a hand had laid the whole weight of the last 4 days back on her chest. She dressed by the window. The wool dress, the boots that had been her mother's, the gray headscarf pinned close, the ash shawl pinned at the throat with the small tin brooch shaped like a wheat sheaf. Her hands did the work without her attention. Downstairs a woman was already at the stove, a broad, plain-spoken woman in a calico apron who introduced herself only as Mrs. Sill and pushed a plate of biscuits and a tin cup of coffee across the plank table without asking whether she wanted them. Mary ate because Mrs. Sill was watching and drank because the coffee was hot. "Lawyer's coming for you," Mrs. Sill said. "Yes." "You'll want another biscuit?" "Yes." That was the whole of it. Mrs. Sill was not a woman who trafficked in soft words, but she wrapped 2 more biscuits in a cloth and pressed the small warm bundle into Mary's hands before she left the table, and Mary understood the kindness in it and thanked her plainly and put the bundle into the pocket of her wool coat where her father's letter still lay folded small against the seam. Alden Hoke arrived at 7:30 with the tin box under one arm and a folded packet of papers under the other. He set them on the table where Mrs. Sill had cleared a place. The tin box was smaller than Mary had pictured, no bigger than a Bible, painted once green and worn now to a soft mottled color that was mostly the memory of green. There was a small hasp on the front, unlocked. Alden Hoke did not open it. He only set his hand flat on the lid a moment, as a man might set his hand on a shoulder, and slid it toward her. "Yours," he said. She did not open it there. Some part of her already understood that whatever her father had put inside that box, he had put there for her to find alone, in the place he had built for her to find it in, and not in a boarding-house kitchen with a stranger stirring beans behind them. She wrapped the tin in the cloth Mrs. Sill had given her and put it into the carpet bag on top of her folded night things. The deed papers she signed where Alden Hoke pointed, once at the bottom and once beside a small pencil mark on the second page, and he witnessed them himself with a steady hand and pressed a blotter to the wet ink and folded the papers into a leather sleeve and gave them to her. "Free and clear," he said again. "Free and clear," she repeated, because saying it back to him seemed to be part of the shape of the thing. He walked her down the boardwalk to the livery. The morning was gray and hard, and the wind had come up off the ridges with the smell of coming weather in it, dry pine and something colder underneath. The livery sat at the far end of town where the street stopped being a street and became only a rutted road running north toward the mountains. A low pole barn, a rail corral, a squat plank office with a stovepipe leaning sideways out the roof. A man was already inside splitting kindling by the door, a spare knotted man in a canvas coat and a battered hat, gray in his beard and gray in the eye that looked up at them. Ord Beeman, the liveryman. "Miss Tanner," Alden Hoke said. "This is Ord Beeman. Ord, this is Ben Tanner's girl." Ord Beeman set the axe head down on the block and touched his hat and looked at her a long, steady moment. He had the kind of face that did not move much and did not need to. "Sorry for your loss, miss," he said. "Thank you. You want the mare, then?" "Yes." He nodded once and turned into the pole barn and did not speak again for a while. Alden Hoke touched Mary's elbow lightly. "I have court in an hour," he said. "Ord will see you up the trail and back. He knows Wheat Ear as well as any man alive. You will be in his hands from here." "Thank you, Mr. Hoke." "Alden," he said. "Alden." He touched the brim of his hat and went off down the street, and Mary was left standing in the cold wind at the mouth of the livery, with the leather sleeve of deed papers under her arm and the tin box in her carpet bag, and Ord Beeman somewhere back among the stalls speaking low to a horse. That was when the laughter started. There were 3 of them, come out onto the plank porch of the saloon across the way with their coffee and their pipes, the way men who do not work for a living stand in the mornings and watch other people work. She did not know their names then and would learn them only slowly. The loud one wore a good black coat and a good black hat and had a face that had never gone hungry. He was leaning on the rail with his elbows spread and his coffee steaming up under his chin, and he had marked her when Alden Hoke walked her past, and he had marked the leather sleeve, and he was speaking now in the carrying voice of a man who wanted to be overheard. "That's Ben Tanner's girl," he said. "Come all the way up from the flats to claim the palace." One of the others laughed. The third one only spat off the porch into the dust. "Deed and everything," the loud one went on. "A whole cabin, papered proper, 11 mile up a trail a mule wouldn't take in weather, and every splinter of it hers." "Warm up there this time of year," said the second man. "Cozy," said the loud one. "Real cozy. Ben laid in enough wood to roast an ox. Doc Reeves said so. Enough wood for 2 winters. Enough flour to bake a wedding. Only he forgot to lay in the wedding." The second man laughed again, higher this time. Mary did not turn her head. She kept her eyes on the pole of the corral in front of her and let the wind move the loose end of her headscarf against her cheek. The tin brooch at her throat was very cold. She counted in her mind, the way her mother had once taught her to count when a thing was said in a room that she was not meant to answer. 1, 2, 3. "Poor old Ben," the loud one said, softer now, but not soft enough. "Building himself a house for ghosts." Ord Beeman came out of the pole barn leading a small round bay mare with a white blaze and a patient eye. He did not look at the saloon porch. He led the mare up to Mary and set the reins in her hand, and began, without a word, to check the girth and adjust the stirrup for her height. His hands were steady and unhurried. He might have been alone in the yard. When he had the stirrup where he wanted it, he stepped back and looked once, briefly, across the street at the loud man in the black coat, and the loud man's mouth closed. "That's Rel Sugget," Ord Beeman said quietly to Mary, not turning his head. "Runs the freight yard. Wanted your father's north pasture 2 years back and did not get it cheap enough to suit him. Pay him no mind, miss. He talks because it is the only work he knows." "Thank you. You ride?" "Some. She is easy. Her name is Juno. She knows the trail. If you drop the reins, she will still take you there." "Thank you." He saddled a rangy roan for himself and swung up without effort in spite of his years, and he clucked once to Juno, and Juno stepped after him as gentle as a lamb, and Mary Tanner rode out of Pine Hollow with the wind at her back and the laughter of Rel Sugget fading behind her into the ordinary morning sounds of a town that did not yet know her name. She did not look back. She had counted to 3 and then let the counting go. They rode north along the rutted road until the road became a track and the track became a trail. The mountains that had been blue at dusk were gray now and close, folded on themselves, seamed with pine. The wind smelled of iron. Juno's small hooves made a soft, steady sound on the frozen ground, and Ord Beeman rode a length ahead and did not speak, and Mary was glad of it. She let her hand rest on the mare's warm neck for the comfort of a living thing under her palm. In her carpetbag behind the saddle, the tin box shifted once and settled. The deed papers were folded into the inside pocket of her coat now, over her heart, where her father's last letter also lay. 2 papers, one from a dying man, one making a living girl the owner of a cabin she had never seen, and both of them warm against her chest. She thought, without meaning to, of the second bed. Doc Reeve had said it was made up. Made up meant sheets, made up meant a pillow, made up meant a person expected, she did not know for whom. She turned the thought over, the way one turns a stone in the palm, and set it down again, because there was no answering it yet, and because Juno had begun the first slow climb up out of the valley, and the trail wanted her attention. Behind her, the town fell away smaller and smaller until it was only a scatter of roofs and the pale thread of the church steeple, and then it was only the memory of a town, and then it was gone entirely behind the shoulder of the first ridge, and Mary Tanner rode on into her inheritance with a stranger for a guide and a tin box for company, and a laughter she would not carry with her ringing already faint and far off in some other person's mourning. Now here is a question worth sitting with. What kind of man lays in 2 winters of wood, sets a second bed, and dies alone before the guest arrives? What was Mary's father waiting for at the head of Weed Ear Draw, and why did he never tell his own daughter her name? If this story has hold of you already, drop a line in the comments and tell us where you're listening from. And stay close, because what waited for Mary inside that cabin was not what any soul in Pine Hollow guessed. They rode a good while without speaking, Juno picking her feet neatly among the loose stones, Ord Beeman a length ahead on the roan, his shoulders squared inside the canvas coat and his hat pulled low. The trail bent through a stand of pine so thick the light came down in green columns, and Mary heard nothing but hoof on packed dirt and the small chime of the roan's bridle. She had thought the mountain would be silent. It was not. It was full of small speech she did not yet know how to hear. At a place where the trail widened and the trees opened onto a shoulder of grass, Ord Beeman reined in and waited for her to come up beside him. He pointed with 2 fingers, not lifting his hand off the pommel. Weed Ear starts yonder, he said. Draw runs north. Mary looked. The valley ahead lay long and narrow, walled by dark timber on both sides, its floor already gone the color of rust and old straw. A creek ran silver down the middle of it. Somewhere at its head, above the last fold of ridge she could see, was the cabin. She could not see it. She could feel that it was there the way one feels a lit lamp behind a closed door. 11 mile? She asked. About. How long? Half a day, easy. We'll make it before noon. He touched his heel to the roan and rode on. Mary followed. She thought about Rel Sudgett on the saloon porch and let the thought move through her and out again, the way water moves through a sieve. She would not carry it. She had decided that already at the livery when she had counted 1, 2, 3 to herself and kept her face still. A man like that fed on what you gave him back. She would give him nothing. Still, his voice would not entirely leave her. A house for ghosts, he had said. Poor old Ben. She thought of her father as she had last seen him, 3 Christmases ago, standing in the door of the boarding-house kitchen with snow on the shoulders of his coat and the small tin brooch in his palm, saying he had picked it because it looked like the fields at home. He had smiled the way he smiled at the end of a long day, tired and pleased at once. He had not looked like a man who would become a rumor. They came down off the shoulder and into the draw proper, and the wind that had been at their backs turned and blew across them from the west. It smelled of pine sap and cold stone and, faintly, of wood smoke, though there was no smoke anywhere Mary could see. Ord Beeman lifted his chin as though he had smelled it too and rode on without comment. At mid-morning they crossed the creek at a shallow ford where flat stones showed above the water like the backs of turtles. Juno stepped from one to the next without being asked. On the far side the trail climbed again through aspen, the leaves gone gold and half of them already fallen, so that the horses walked through a shifting yellow light that lay on the ground and in the air both. Mary thought without wanting to that her father would have loved this place. Then she thought that he had loved it. That was why the cabin was here. They stopped once to breathe the horses at a clearing where an old blowdown lay across the trail, its roots a black wheel of dirt taller than a man. Ord Beeman dismounted, checked the roan's off hind, and stood a moment looking up the draw. "Your daddy," he said, not turning, "cut through this log himself, 2 summers ago, axe and a bucksaw, alone." Mary looked at the notch through the trunk. It was clean, square, patient work. "You knew him," she said. "Some. What was he like?" Ord Beeman thought about it a while before he answered. He had the habit, Mary saw, of turning a question the way she had turned the thought of the second bed, weighing it before he let it out of his hand. "Quiet," he said at last. "Fair. Didn't waste words nor lumber." He mounted again. That was all he offered, and Mary did not press him. It was more than she had expected. She rode on with the shape of it warm in her. Quiet, fair, didn't waste words nor lumber, and let the aspen leaves come down on her shoulders like a slow yellow rain. An hour later, at a bend where the trail passed close to the creek, they came upon an old man sitting on a flat stone beside the water. He had a small fire going in a ring of blackened rocks and a tin cup steaming on a peeled stick beside it. His coat was patched at both elbows with a darker wool, and his boots were the kind of boots a man wore because they had stopped hurting his feet a long time ago. His hair was white and cropped close, and his beard was white and not cropped at all. Beside him lay a walking staff of peeled pine and a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. He did not look surprised to see them. He looked as though he had been waiting for the trail to bring somebody along and did not particularly mind whom. Ord Beeman drew rein and touched his hat. "Morning, Jeb." "Morning, Ord. You're a ways from home." "I'm home wherever the fire's mine." Ord Beeman almost smiled at that. He half turned in the saddle. "Miss Tanner, this here's Jeb Ainsley. Trapped this country when there wasn't a town in it. Knows every draw between here and the pass." Jeb Ainsley lifted his eyes to Mary. They were the pale blue of ice at the edge of a creek, and they took her in slowly, from the tin brooch at her throat, to the mother's boots in the stirrups, to Juno's white blaze, and then came to rest on her face. "Ben Tanner's girl," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," Mary said. He nodded once, small and grave. "I was sorry to hear it." "Thank you." He looked at her a moment longer. The fire ticked between them. Somewhere back in the aspens, a jay called twice and stopped. Jeb Ainsley reached without looking and turned the tin cup on its stick a quarter turn, so the steam went a different direction, and then he spoke again, and his voice had changed. It had gone slower and more formal, as though he were reciting something learned long ago from a book Mary had never read. "Child," he said, "what your father laid up wasn't for winter. It was for a road that didn't finish. Keep the fire, and the road will come to you." Mary opened her mouth and then closed it. The words settled in her the way a stone settles in still water, sending out one ring and then another, and then going quiet on the bottom. She did not understand them. She understood that she was not meant to, yet. "Sir?" she said. But Jeb Ainsley was already looking back at his fire. He turned the cup another quarter turn and lifted it and blew across the top of it, and whatever door had opened in him had closed again. He was only an old man at a creek with a hot drink and a walking staff. Ord Beeman waited a decent moment. Then he touched his hat again. "We'll be moving on." "Ride easy," Jeb Ainsley said. They rode. Mary did not look back at the old man, though she wanted to. She kept her eyes on the roan's tail ahead of her, and her hand on Juno's warm neck, and she said the sentence over to herself under her breath so she would not lose the shape of it. "What your father laid up wasn't for winter. It was for a road that didn't finish. Keep the fire, and the road will come to you." She did not know what road. She did not know whose. She tucked the words in beside her father's letter and the deed papers in the pocket over her heart and rode on. After a time, Ord Beeman spoke without turning. "Don't fret his talk," he said. "Jeb sees crooked sometimes. Been alone too long." "Has he?" Mary said. "Man lives 30 years in a line shack. He starts hearing what ain't said. Or hearing what is." Ord Beeman glanced back at her then, quick and appraising, and did not answer. He rode on. The trail climbed steadily now, out of the aspen and back into pine, and the air grew thinner and colder and cleaner. Mary's ears rang faintly with the altitude. She thought of the town falling away behind them, and of Rel Sudgett on the porch with his good black coat and his good black hat. and she thought of Jeb Ainsley at his small fire with his patched elbows and his ice-blue eyes, and it seemed to her, writing, that these two men were the two halves of what waited for her in Pine Hollow. One would laugh at anything he did not own. The other would speak once and only once, and mean every word of it, and never explain. She thought of her father between them, quiet, fair, wasting neither words nor lumber, and she felt for the first time since the telegram a small, hard warmth in her chest that was not grief. It was something like pride. She did not name it yet. She only felt it there, the way one feels a coal banked under ash. Near noon they came out of the pines onto a bare shoulder of the mountain, and Ord Beeman drew rein again and pointed. "There," he said. Mary looked. Half a mile ahead, at the very head of the draw, where the timber thinned and the creek was born out of a black seep in the rock, a small cabin stood on a level place beside the water. It was built of squared logs, chinked pale, roofed in split shakes gone silver with weather. A stone chimney rose out of the north gable. A pole corral stood behind it, empty. A shed leaned against the west wall, tidy and square. Beside the shed, stacked as neatly as a mason stacks brick, was the wood pile, long and tall and dark with age at one end and pale with fresh split at the other, a rank of cordwood that even at this distance did not look like the work of a man laying in for one winter or for himself alone. Mary sat Juno very still. The wind had dropped. The whole valley was holding its breath. "That's it," Ord Beeman said. "Yes," Mary said. He looked at her sidelong. "You want a minute?" "No." She touched her heel to Juno's side and rode down toward the cabin at a walk, and Ord Beeman came behind her, and the smoke she had smelled hours ago on the wind was not smoke at all now, because no fire burned in that chimney, and no lamp was lit in that window, and no one at all had come out onto the porch at the sound of hoofbeats in the yard. They came into the yard slow. Juno's hooves made a soft double sound on the packed dirt of the path, and then a hollower sound as they crossed a flat of river stones someone had laid for a walkway, and then quiet again on the trampled grass by the porch step. Ord Beeman drew up 10 paces behind her and did not dismount. Mary understood without turning that he was giving her the yard. She sat a moment with her hands on the saddle horn. She looked at the door. It was a plain plank door, hung on iron hinges, hammered by someone who cared to hammer them right. There was no lock, only a wooden latch and a leather thong through a hole for lifting it from outside. The thong hung down. Her father had left the thong out. Mary swung down. Her mother's boots met the ground harder than she expected. She stood a moment with her forehead against Juno's shoulder to steady herself, and Juno breathed once against her ear, deep and warm, and did not move. Mary took the reins over the mare's head and led her to the corral rail and looped them there. She untied the carpetbag from behind the saddle and set it on the porch step. Then she stood at the bottom of that step and looked up at the door of the cabin her father had built for her and never told her about. The porch was 1 board wide and 3 boards long. The boards were pine, planed smooth, and worn at the middle where a boot would fall. Above the door, cut shallow into the header log with a chisel and left unpainted, were 3 letters, M.T., her own initials. She looked at them a long time. Ord Beeman, still mounted, said nothing at all. Mary went up the step. She put her thumb under the leather thong and lifted the latch. The door opened inward, dragging a little where the sill had swelled, and gave into a room that smelled of cold pine, cold ash, cold cloth, and something fainter under those, something like the pipe her father used to smoke on the porch of the old ranch house when she was a child. She stopped in the doorway. The room was 1 room. It ran the width of the cabin and most of its length. At the far end, a stone hearth was built into the north wall, with a black iron stove set in front of it, and the flue running up through the mantelpiece into the chimney. On the west wall stood a plank table with 2 chairs, 1 at each end. On the east wall stood 2 beds. 2. She knew there would be 2. Doc Reeve had said so. Alden Hoke had said so. Rel Sudgett on the saloon porch had said so, with a mouthful of pity that was not pity. She had ridden 11 miles with the fact of that second bed shifting in her carpetbag like a coin. And still, standing in the doorway and seeing them there in the pale light of the one window, she felt something go out of her legs. Both beds were made, both. Sheets tucked square at the corners, wool blankets folded across the foot, pillows plumped and set at the head. On the nearer bed, the one closer to the stove, the blanket was gray with a faded blue stripe, and the pillow was a little flat. That was the bed a man had slept in. On the farther bed, against the wall under a small oil painting of a wheat field she had never seen before, the blanket was newer, a soft brown with a cream border, and the pillow was full and untouched. At the foot of that bed, folded neat, lay a smaller quilt of pieced calico, the kind a woman would piece for a child, in reds and blues and buttery yellows, with a border of tiny white stars. Mary put a hand on the doorframe. She stood in the doorway a long minute without going forward. Behind her, she heard Ord Behmen dismount finally, heard the creak of his saddle and the small chuff of the roan blowing out at the sudden stop, and then his boots crossing the yard slowly toward the shed, giving her privacy the only way a man on a mountain knows how, by finding some other thing to do. Mary stepped inside. The floor was pine plank, wide, pegged, swept clean. Someone had swept it recently. She could see the faint arc of a broom's last stroke in the light dust by the door. She walked the length of the room in her mother's boots, and each footfall sounded loud to her, though the boots were soft. She stopped at the plank table. 2 chairs, 2 tin plates, 2 tin cups upside down on a folded cloth. A single kerosene lamp with its chimney wiped, its wick trimmed, its brass base polished by a hand that had cared. Beside it, a small bundle of matches tied with string. She turned to the shelves along the west wall. There were 3 shelves, and every one of them was full. Flour in a stone crock with a wooden lid, salt in a smaller crock beside it, a tin of coffee, a tin of tea, a row of glass jars of beans, of dried apples, of dried corn, of something red she thought might be rose hips, a jar of honey darker than any honey she had seen since the last summer at home. A small crock of lard, sealed, 2 tins of lamp oil, a round of soap wrapped in paper, a packet of needles and a spool of black thread, a packet of needles and a spool of white, a pair of woman's woolen stockings, folded, unworn, still tied with the mercantile's twine. Mary reached out and touched the twine on the stockings and did not lift them. She drew her hand back. Beside the stove, in a wooden box, kindling was split fine and stacked cross-hatched for air. Beside the box, a metal scuttle held pine cones for starter. Beside the scuttle, 3 iron pots hung on pegs, the smallest no bigger than her 2 fists, the largest big enough for a stew that would feed 4 men. All 3 had been scoured. On the top of the stove sat a kettle. She touched the kettle. Cold. Cold and dry inside, but wiped. She lifted the round lid of the stove with the iron hook that hung on a nail beside it. Inside, on the grate, lay a small, careful nest of kindling and shavings, and a single half-burned pine cone, laid ready to catch a match. Her father had left the stove laid for the next fire. Whoever came in cold and hungry and tired would only need to strike 1 match and put it under. Mary put the lid back down. She stood with the iron hook in her hand and looked at nothing. Ord Bemen's boots came back across the porch. He stopped at the door and did not enter. "Miss Tanner." "Yes." "Corral's tight. Roof looks sound. Shed's dry. There's oats in a barrel out there, half full. Enough for a horse a good long while." "Thank you. There's more wood in the shed than what's on the pile, and there's a second pile behind the shed I didn't count." "Thank you." He waited a beat. Then he said, "You all right, ma'am?" It was not a question the way he said it. It was an offering. "Yes," she said. She did not turn from the stove. He said, "I'll water the horses at the creek." She heard him step down off the porch. She heard the reins slip off the rail. She heard hooves on the river stones, and then on the grass down toward the water. Alone, Mary walked to the far bed. She knelt at the foot of it and put her palm flat on the pieced calico quilt. The cloth was cool from the room. The stitching was small and even. Along the border, in tiny white stars, ran a running stitch a woman had done by lamplight through many evenings. Her father had not sewn this. Her father had never sewn anything but a bridle strap in his life. He had gotten this quilt somewhere. He had paid for it, or traded for it, or carried it up the trail folded across his saddle, and had laid it here at the foot of a bed that had never been slept in, for a child that had never come. Mary did not weep. The tears sat behind her eyes and did not fall. Something in her had gone very still, the way an animal goes still when it hears its own name spoken in a language it did not know it knew. She stood up. She walked to the small oil painting on the wall above the far bed. It was no bigger than a book. A wheat field in late summer, a rail fence at the near edge, a line of low hills behind, a sky the pale color of watered milk. In the corner, in small brown letters, someone had painted a word she could not read at first, and then she made it out. Home. Only that. Home. She lifted the painting off its nail. Behind it, the log was blank. She hung it back where it had been and straightened it with the flat of her hand. She turned to her own bed, the one nearer the stove, the one that had been slept in. She sat on the edge of it. The rope frame under the mattress creaked, and the sound of that creak in the empty room was the loneliest sound she had ever heard. She sat there with her hands on her knees and looked at the stove her father had laid for the next fire. And she understood then, in a way she had not understood on the coach, or in the mercantile with Alden Hoke, or on the boarding-house porch, or through 11 miles of trail on Juneau's warm back, that her father had built this house for 2 women, not one, 2, her and another. And the other had not come. She sat a long minute. Then she rose. She crossed to the stove. She took a match from the bundle on the table. She struck it on the iron and touched it to the shavings her father had laid. The fire caught. It licked up through the pine cone and into the kindling and settled in with a small sigh. And a thin white smoke went up the flue for the first time since the man who built the fire had died. Mary stood with her hand still on the iron hook and watched the flame come alive in the dark belly of the stove her father had left ready for her. She said nothing. The stove ticked once as its metal remembered warmth. Outside, Ord Beeman was leading the horses back up from the creek. Inside, in a cabin no one in Pine Hollow would ever have called anything but a shack, in a valley 11 miles from any other soul, in the light of a fire her dead father had laid for her and someone else, Mary Tanner set the iron hook back on its nail and stayed. Ord Beeman came back to the door with the smell of creek water on his coat and did not step inside. He stood on the porch board and looked past Mary at the fire beginning in the stove and said the horses were fed and standing. He said Juneau would be fine at the rail with a blanket for the night. He said the roan would be fine too. He said the sun would be off the ridge in 3 hours and he could ride back down in the light if she was staying. Mary said she was staying. Ord Beeman took a slow breath through his nose. He looked at the 2 beds and looked away from them. He said he would come up again in 4 days with more oats and see how she was, and if the weather turned before then, he would come sooner. He said the trail was mostly kind to a person who knew it, and mostly unkind to one who did not. He said if she needed to come out, she was to wait for a clear morning and follow the creek down until she met the wagon road, and not to try the shortcut through the aspen no matter how it looked, because it looked like a trail and was not one. Mary said she would remember. Ord Beeman set a small paper twist of matches on the table beside the bundle her father had left and said Mrs. Sill had sent them, along with a wedge of cheese wrapped in cloth and a jar of pickled beets that he now carried in from his saddlebag and put on the shelf between the flour crock and the tin of coffee. He said Mrs. Sill had said not to argue. He said Alden had sent a candle and 2 more matches wrapped in oiled paper against damp, and he placed those on the table too. He said Doc Reeve had sent nothing because Doc Reeve did not know Ord was coming back up, and he half smiled when he said it, and it was the closest thing to a smile Mary had seen on him. Then he went out. She heard him at the corral speaking low to Juneau, heard the creak of leather as he shifted the mare's blanket, heard him mount the roan and settle in the saddle, heard the roan blow once and step out at a walk. She did not go to the door. She sat at the table and listened until the sound of the roan's hooves went from the yard into the trees and from the trees into a thin distance and then into nothing. The cabin was very quiet after that. Mary sat with her hands flat on the plank table for a while and let her eyes go around the room again slowly, more slowly than the first time, because now no one was watching her look. The fire in the stove settled into itself and ticked and warmed the iron, and the iron began to warm the room. She could feel it first on her wrists where they rested against the wood, and then along her cheek, and then in a soft way along her legs through the wool of the dress. She unpinned the shawl and folded it over the back of the chair. She left the tin brooch on the collar of the dress. She rose. She began at the stove and worked outward, touching things. She touched the wooden lid of the flour crock and lifted it. The flour inside was pale and dry and clean, sifted again, no weevils, no darkening at the edge. She had helped a boarding-house cook long enough to know good flour by sight and by the small dry ring of the wooden lid when she set it back. She lifted the salt lid. The salt was coarse, gray at the crystal edges, dry. She lifted the coffee tin. The coffee inside was whole bean, dark, oily, and enough of it to last a careful person the fall. She lifted the tea tin. The tea was leaf, black, with a faint dry green note under it, and there was more of it than a man alone would drink in a season. Her father had not been a great drinker of tea. He had drunk coffee at the ranch from a blue enamel cup with too much sugar. Mary set the tea tin back and stood a moment with her hand on the shelf. The stockings were what caught her next. She lifted the woolen stockings her father had bought for someone, still tied with mercantile twine. They were long, well knit, of good sheep, gray wool with a small band of cream at the top. They were not her size. She held them up against her leg and saw that they would come well past her knee and bag at the ankle. They had been bought for a taller woman. She set them back gently, tucked the twine ends under, and stood a moment more. She went to the farther bed and lifted the pieced calico quilt from the foot of it into her arms. It was lighter than it looked and smelled faintly of cedar, as though it had lain in a cedar chest before it lay here. She spread it on the table under the lamp and studied it in the poor light coming through the small east window. The pieces were small, no wider than her thumb, and cut from many different bolts. She recognized some of them. A red with a small white flower she remembered from a dress her mother had worn to church one summer. A dark blue with pale specks that had been the lining of her mother's Sunday coat. A buttery yellow she did not recognize. A pale gray with a leaf pattern that she was almost sure had come from an apron she had used at the ranch as a girl and lost track of when they moved off it. The stars in the border were white cotton, no bigger than a thumbnail each, and there were more of them than she felt like counting. Her mother had not made this quilt. Her mother had been dead 6 years and had not been a piecer, only a mender. Someone else had made it, someone who had gotten cloth from Mary's mother's things, or from Mary's father, and had sat over it for a long winter. Mary folded the quilt back the way she had found it and returned it to the foot of the farther bed and smoothed it there and did not let her hand linger. She went next to the small oil painting of the wheat field above the bed. She had already lifted it once. Now she stood in front of it and looked at it as a picture instead of an object. The rail fence at the near edge was the rail fence at the north pasture of the ranch. She was sure of it. She had climbed that fence as a girl. The low hills behind were the shape of the hills west of the house, seen from the kitchen door in August. The pale, watered milk sky was the sky in that country at the end of a hot afternoon. Whoever had painted this had stood in her mother's kitchen doorway or somewhere very near it, and had known the word for what they were looking at. Home. Mary looked at the small brown letters in the corner again. There were no initials, only the word. She turned from the painting and went to the plank table and sat down at the chair on the near side, the chair closer to the stove, and she noticed then, for the first time, that both chairs had been sat in. The seat of the near chair was worn smooth in a hollow where a man's weight had rocked back over years. The seat of the far chair had a shallower wear, narrower, and the wood underneath was still lighter, less oiled by use. It had been sat in, but not often, and not for years. It had been sat in recently enough that a hand had brushed the seat clean. Mary put her palm flat on the far chair's seat. It was cold. It was very cold. She sat with her own hand on that cold chair for a long minute, and then withdrew it and folded her hands together in her lap. That was when she heard the sound in the wall. It was a small sound, not the wind, not the fire. It came from the north wall, above the stove, up near the eaves where the chimney stones went through the log. It was a soft, dry scrape once, and then a pause, and then again, once, and then nothing. She sat still and listened. It did not come again. She thought a bird or a squirrel or a mouse that had made a nest in a warm gap during the summer and was now surprised by heat. She rose and went to the wall and stood under the sound and looked up. The logs there were snug, chinked pale, and she could see no gap. The chimney stones were mortared tight. The mantelpiece was a single squared beam laid across, and on the beam sat one object she had not noticed before, because it was set far back against the stones where the shadow fell. Mary reached up and took it down. It was a small wooden box, no bigger than her hand, made of what looked like cherry, oiled dark, with a lid that slid in a groove rather than lifted on a hinge. There was nothing on the outside of the box. She held it in both hands a moment and considered whether to open it now or wait for Ord Beeman's next visit, or for some other later time when she felt stronger. Then she thought that she was as strong now as she would ever be about it, and she slid the lid open. Inside was a lock of hair. It was a fine, soft lock, dark brown, tied with a length of white ribbon so narrow it could have been a thread. Under the lock of hair was folded a scrap of paper, no larger than a playing card. Mary lifted the lock of hair out and set it on the table with more care than she had known she possessed, and unfolded the scrap of paper. The paper had 2 lines written on it in her father's hand, cramped, in pencil that had smudged in places from being carried. The first line was a date, written the way her father always wrote dates, month spelled out, day, year. It was a date from the spring before last. The second line was a single word, and then a second single word after a small dash, and Mary read them slowly, and read them again, to be sure. Ruth, Ellie. She sat down at the plank table with the paper in her hand and the lock of hair on the table beside it, and she did not weep because she did not know yet who Ruth was, or who Ellie was, or which of them the lock of hair had come from, or which of them her father had loved, or in what order, or how. She only knew that there were 2 names now in the cabin with her, and that they were the names her father had not written to her, and that the second bed had been made up for one of them, and the small calico quilt for the other. Outside, the light on the ridge began to slant toward gold, and inside, the fire in the stove ticked steadily, and Mary Tanner sat with a lock of a stranger's hair on the wood between her hands, and did not yet know what she was going to do. She slid the paper back into the box. She lifted the lock of hair with both hands and laid it in on top, and slid the lid closed and set the box back on the mantel beam, farther forward this time, out of the shadow, where the firelight could find it. Then she went to the shelf, took down the smallest of the 3 iron pots, dipped water from the covered bucket by the door that Ord Beeman had filled from the creek, set the pot on the stove, and put in a small handful of tea from the tin. She did it without thinking about doing it. Her hands did the work while her mind stayed on the mantel. While the water heated, she stood at the small east window and looked out at the yard. Juno stood at the corral rail with the blanket over her back, one hip cocked, drowsing. The woodpile threw a long, even shadow across the trampled grass. The shed door stood a hand's width open the way Ord Beeman had left it. Beyond the corral, the aspen ran gold up the slope in the late slant of the sun, and beyond the aspen the pine went dark. Nothing moved. The kettle in the pot began to whisper. Mary took it off with the cloth, poured a cup, and sat back down at the plank table. She did not sit in the far chair. She sat in the near chair, in her father's hollow, and drank the tea he had bought for a woman who had not come. She thought of Jeb Ainsley at the creek, turning the tin cup a quarter turn on its stick, and saying that what her father had laid up was for a road that had not finished. She thought of Rel Sudgett on the saloon porch, calling it a house for ghosts. She thought of Alden Hoke folding the deed papers into a leather sleeve and saying, "Free and clear." She thought of Doc Reeve saying his heart was tired. She did not yet act. She only listened and drank and let the two names on the scrap of paper sit in the room with her while the fire went about its quiet work in the stove. Ruth. Ellie. The light went slowly out of the ridge above the cabin, and the shadow of the woodpile crept up the porch board, and the fire in the stove ticked, and above the beam on the mantel the small cherry box sat with its lid closed, and Mary Tanner sat under it and did not yet ask it anything more. The first true dark came into the cabin the way water comes into a low place, without sound. Mary rose from the near chair and set the tin cup upside down on the folded cloth beside the other two. She lit the kerosene lamp with a splinter drawn from the stove, trimmed the wick down until the flame steadied into a small, clean yellow leaf, and set the chimney back over it. The glass caught the fire and threw a soft round of light onto the plank table. Around that round of light the room fell into shape again. The stove ticked. The bucket at the door made no sound. Juno at the rail outside blew once, low and settled. Mary went to the door and drew the leather thong through its hole from the inside, so the latch could not be lifted from the yard. She stood a moment with her hand on the wood. She had never in her life shut a door on a night this dark and known no other roof stood within 11 miles of her. She listened for what a person listens for in a first strange dark, and heard only her own breathing, the fire, and, far off in the timber, one small sound like a branch shifting under snow that was not yet there. She turned back to the room and began, without deciding to work. She banked the fire in the stove the way her father had banked fires at the ranch when she was small, laying a fresh split of pine on the coals lengthwise and drawing the draft down until the flame licked slow and blue along the underside. She washed the tin cup and the pot in a splash of hot water from the kettle and dried them on the folded cloth and set them mouth down. She wiped the plank table with the damp cloth. She swept the arc of dust by the door out over the sill with the broom that stood in the corner. The broom's straw was worn at one side from a hand always sweeping the same direction. Her father had been left-handed, and so was she. She unpacked her carpet bag onto the near bed. 2 spare wool dresses, one gray, one darker gray, a folded nightdress, a wooden comb, a cake of soap in waxed paper, a small square of pressed muslin her mother had embroidered along the edge with a running vine, brought from the boarding house without knowing quite why, the green tin box wrapped in Mrs. Sill's cloth, the leather sleeve of deed papers, her father's last letter, folded 4 times, worn soft at the creases. She set the green tin box on the plank table beside the lamp and laid the letter and the deed papers next to it, but she did not open the tin box yet. She had ridden a long day. She would come to it in its own time. She fetched water from the covered bucket, poured a little into the smallest pot, warmed it on the stove, and washed her face and her hands. She wiped them on the muslin. The soap on the shelf, a round wrapped in paper, she did not open. She used her own. She put her hair back into its braid, tightened the pin at the tin brooch, and pulled the ash shawl again over her shoulders against the cold that came up through the pegged pine floor from the crawl beneath. Then she took the lamp off the table and, holding it in front of her, she walked the room once, slowly, corner to corner, without hurry, the way her father had walked around a new horse before he touched it. She began at the door and moved along the west wall past the shelves. The lamp lifted small shadows out of things. She saw now that the flour crock had been set on a little square of oiled paper to keep the wood dry beneath it. She saw that the jars on the shelf were arranged by height, the tallest at the back, so no jar hid another. She saw that the label on the honey jar was in her father's cramped pencil hand, and that it read only "Honey, Dark," and then a date from the September before last. She saw a small hook driven into the underside of the middle shelf from which hung a pair of tin snips and a spool of copper wire. She had not seen those on the first pass. Her father had put them within reach of a hand at the table without displaying them. She moved along the north wall past the stove and the hearth and stopped at the mantel. The cherry box sat where she had set it, forward in the lamp's light. Beside it, at the far end of the beam, was a small iron nail driven in and turned down like a hook. On the nail, so quiet against the beam that she had walked past it 3 times, hung a woman's plain silver ring on a length of dark twine. Mary lifted it off. The band was worn thin along the inside where a finger had worked it for years. She held it into the lamp and looked at it for a long minute and put it back on the nail. She did not put it in the cherry box. It seemed her father had set it out where the person who owned it could find it by feel in the dark. She moved along the east wall past the two beds and the small painting. Under the farther bed, pushed back against the wall, was a low wooden crate she had not seen from the doorway. She knelt and drew it out with both hands. It was heavier than it looked. Inside, wrapped in a length of clean flour sack, was a pair of child's shoes. They were small, not infant small, the shoes of a child of 5, perhaps 6. Brown leather, soft, well made, the soles unscuffed, the laces new and stiff, tied in a bow that no foot had ever pulled loose. Beside the shoes lay a folded child's dress in dark blue wool with a small white collar, and beside the dress a knitted cap the color of buttermilk, and beside the cap a wooden horse no bigger than Mary's palm, carved out of a single piece of pine, with the mane cut in shallow parallel grooves and the eyes marked with the point of a burnt match. The wood at the horse's belly was worn smooth in the shape of a thumb. Her father had held it while he worked at it, turning it in his fingers, the way he had turned the tin brooch in his palm on the Christmas he gave it to her. Mary sat on the plank floor with the lamp beside her and lifted the wooden horse and held it in her own palm. She turned it once. The stove ticked behind her. She thought of Ellie on the scrap of paper in the cherry box, and of Ruth, and of the calico quilt at the foot of the bed, and of the woolen stockings on the shelf that would come well past her own knee. 3 sets of things, a woman's ring, a woman's stockings, a child's shoes and a child's dress, and a child's carved horse. Her father had furnished this cabin for a mother and a small daughter, and he had set out each thing at the height a hand would find it in the dark. She wrapped the shoes and the dress and the cap again in the flour sack, laid the wooden horse on top, and slid the crate back under the farther bed with both hands. She did not put the horse back inside the sack. She set it on the pillow of the farther bed, upright, facing the door, as if to watch for whoever came. She rose. Her knees ached from the ride. She carried the lamp to the plank table and sat down again in the near chair. For a long minute she did not do anything at all. Then she drew the green tin box across the wood toward her. The paint on the lid had once been dark green and had faded in the middle to the color of moss on a north stone. The hasp was small and unlocked. She opened it. Inside were letters, a tidy stack of them, tied twice with a length of the same narrow white ribbon that bound the lock of hair in the cherry box. On top of the stack, folded once and not tied in, was a single sheet of paper in her father's hand, addressed simply, "For Mary." Beneath it the ribboned bundle was addressed on the outer envelope in the same cramped pencil, "To Ruth Amberley, care of the Cheyenne House, hold until called for." Mary set the addressed bundle to one side. She did not untie it. She lifted the loose sheet with the 2 words for her name at the top and unfolded it, and by the small yellow leaf of the lamp she read the first line her father had written to her since spring. "Girl," it began, "if you are reading this at the plank table, then Alden came through the way I asked, and Ord got you up the trail without letting you take the Aspen shortcut. Do not take the Aspen shortcut. It looks like a trail. It is not one." She read the line twice. She could hear his voice under it. She had not heard it in 3 years. Her chest went tight, and she set the paper down flat on the wood and pressed her palm across it, and waited a long moment until she could see the writing again without the letters swimming. Then she picked it up and went on. The letter was not long. Half a page, both sides, in the cramped, careful hand of a man not used to writing much. He told her that the ranch was gone, and that he had not written her about the losing of it because he had not wanted her to come running to a place that was no longer a place. He told her he had taken what money the auction left him and put it into logs and shakes and iron and a small piece of ground at the head of the draw. He told her the cabin was hers, deeded, taxed, free and clear, and that Alden had the papers ready for her hand. He told her he had laid in enough of everything to carry 3 through a winter because he had hoped there would be 3, and that if there were only 1, the extra would keep. He told her the woolen stockings on the shelf were not for her, and that she was to leave them where they were until the woman they were bought for came for them, or until spring, whichever came first. He told her the wooden horse on the crate under the far bed was not to be given away. He told her, at the end, that if the woman and the child did not come by the first hard snow, she was to close the door against the weather and stay warm and read the letters in the bundle, in the order they were tied, and that after she had read them, she would know what her father had been about these last 2 years, and that she was to decide for herself. Then, what a daughter owed a father's unfinished road. He signed it, "Your daddy," and beneath that, Ben. Mary folded the letter along its old creases and laid it flat under her hand on the wood, and sat a long time without moving. The stove ticked. Outside, Juno shifted at the rail, and the leather of her blanket creaked once against the wood. In the shed, the door with its hand's width of open moved a hair on its hinge, in a small breath of wind off the ridge, and made a sound like a person drawing in air to speak and then thinking better of it. Mary did not untie the ribboned bundle that night. She had been given a road by her father, and she meant to walk it in the order he had laid it. She put the loose letter back into the tin box, with the ribboned bundle beneath it, closed the lid, and set the box on the mantel beside the cherry box, so that the 2 boxes sat together above the fire with the silver ring on its twine between them. Then she took the lamp to the near bed, turned the wick down until only a red thread of ember showed at the tip, laid the lamp on the low stool beside the bed, and lay down in her wool dress with the ash shawl pulled up to her chin. She did not undress. She listened to the fire and to Juno at the rail and to the shed door on its slow hinge and to the great silence of the draw beyond, and she thought of the small wooden horse standing on the pillow of the farther bed watching the door, and of the woman named Ruth Amberley, whose letters were tied in ribbon and had never been called for, and of the child named Ellie, whose shoes had never been worn, and somewhere between one breath and the next she slept. Mary woke once in the deep of the night to a wolf calling from a ridge somewhere off to the north, and lay listening until another answered from farther off, and both went quiet. She waited to see if Juno would fret at the rail, and Juno did not. She turned her face to the wall and slept again, and did not dream. At first light she rose in the same wool dress she had lain down in, added a split of pine to the stove, drew the draught up, and set the kettle on. The window was fogged white with the breath of the room against the cold glass. She wiped a circle clear with the heel of her hand, and saw a thin skin of frost along the top rail of the corral, and Juno standing with her head low in the pail, and beyond Juno the aspen gone from gold to the color of bruised copper where the leaves had fallen in the night. It was going to be a bright day. It was going to be a cold one. She fed and watered the mare from the barrel of oats and a bucket from the creek, moving with her mother's boots stiff on the frozen grass, and rubbed Juno's neck under the coarse mane a long minute for company, as much as for the horse. When she came back inside, the kettle was singing. She made tea in the smallest iron pot, and cut a piece of Mrs. Sill's cheese and one of the biscuits she had wrapped in cloth the morning she left the boarding house, which was already a life ago. She ate at the plank table in the near chair, in her father's hollow, with the tin box and the cherry box on the mantel above her, and the silver ring on its twine between them. When she had eaten, she washed the cup and set it upside down on the folded cloth. She put another split of pine into the stove. She sat down at the table and drew the tin box toward her. She untied the ribboned bundle then. The ribbon was narrow and white, and had been tied more than once, the creases in it worn soft where a knot had been pulled and reset. She did not cut it. She worked the knot loose with her thumb and the pared edge of her nail, and laid the ribbon flat on the table beside the stack. There were 17 letters. She counted them twice. Some were in envelopes and some were folded and sealed with a smear of tallow. All were in her father's cramped pencil hand. All were addressed to Ruth Amberley, care of the Cheyenne house, hold until called for. None had been opened. None had come back. They had never been sent. Mary understood at once, sitting there in the near chair with the pale morning light coming through the wiped circle of glass, that a man may write a letter with no intention of putting it in the post, and that a bundle of unsent letters tied twice with a white ribbon is a different thing altogether from a bundle of returned ones. She laid her hand flat on the top letter for a long minute, as though asking permission of a person who could no longer grant it, and then she picked up the topmost and turned it over. The tallow was hard and yellow. She broke it with her thumbnail and unfolded the paper. The first letter was dated in the summer 3 years past. A month before the last Christmas, he had come down to see her at the boarding house, with the tin brooch in his palm. It began, Mrs. Amberley, in a formal hand, and thanked her for her answer to his notice about the north pasture, saying that he was sorry the price he could offer had not suited her situation, but that he would be pleased to keep her letter and to think on what else might be done. It said nothing that Mary would not have expected from a man who had once been trying to sell off a piece of ground to a woman he did not know. She read it twice and set it down face up on the table to her left and picked up the next. The second letter was 2 months after the first, and no longer began Mrs. Amberley. It began Ruth, and did not apologize for beginning so. It said that he had thought a great deal about what she had written of her husband, who had been killed by a fall from a wagon on the road out of Laramie the winter before, and of the child, and that he did not know what a stranger could rightly say to such a thing, but that he was sorry, and that if she would forgive him the presumption, he wished to say so plain. It said the north pasture was no longer his to offer, that the bank had taken it in the spring, and that he was thinking of building a small place further up in a mountain valley he knew, and that if she and the girl had no other road open to them by the following fall, they were to write to him, and he would send for them. He signed it Ben Tanner. Mary set the second letter down beside the first and did not pick up the third yet. She got up from the chair and went to the stove and lifted the lid with the iron hook and looked at the fire and put another split of pine in and set the lid back and stood a minute with her hand on the warm iron. Then she came back and sat and picked up the third. The third was 3 weeks later. It said Ruth's answer had come and that he had read it twice and would keep it. It said he understood there were reasons a widow with a small child might not wish to write to a man who was near enough a stranger, and that he was grateful she had written anyway, and that he had put down a foundation of squared logs on a level place beside a creek at the head of a draw called Weedier, and had begun the walls. It said the roof would go on before snow if the weather held. The fourth was written after the first snow of that year. It said the roof was on. It said he had built 2 beds because a child ought not to sleep in her mother's bed after the age of walking, and that the second bed was smaller and set against the west wall under the place where he meant to hang a painting of a wheat field he had bought off a peddler in Cheyenne, who did not know what he had. It said he had bought a pair of woolen stockings at the mercantile for a woman taller than his daughter and had felt foolish carrying them out under his arm. Mary read the fourth letter twice and looked up at the shelf and saw the woolen stockings folded there still tied with mercantile twine, and she looked at the painting of the wheat field above the farther bed with the word home in small brown letters in the corner, and she understood that the west wall of the cabin as her father had first meant it and the east wall as he had built it were the same wall by another name, and that a man alone drawing a cabin on a piece of paper in Cheyenne 2 years before is a different creature from the man who at last stands in it with a hammer in his hand. She read on. The fifth was in the spring. It said he had bought a small carved horse off a Norwegian who was leaving the country because the country had beaten him, and that the horse's belly was worn smooth as if a child had already loved it and left it behind, and that he did not know if that made it better or worse to give, but that he had bought it anyway. It said he had put it in a wooden crate under the small bed with a pair of brown leather shoes he had ordered from a cobbler in Cheyenne, against a size Ruth had written him, and a dark blue dress with a white collar and a knitted cap the color of buttermilk. It said he would not open the crate again until they came. Mary looked down at her boots on the pegged floor and then at the crate under the farther bed and did not go to it. The 6th was in the summer, and the 7th and the 8th. They said the woodpile was growing. They said he had put by flour enough for 3 through a winter, and salt and beans and honey and dark tea, because Ruth had written that she preferred tea, and that her daughter, whose name in this letter for the first time was written out in full as Eleanor, called by Ellie, was old enough for weak tea with a great deal of milk. They said he had traded a saddle he did not need any more for a pieced quilt off a woman in the town below who had lost her own child in the diphtheria the year before, and who told him when he asked for it that she was glad it would go to a living one. They said he had cut a shallow M&T into the header log above the door with a chisel, because the deed would be in the daughter's name, and the house would be the daughter's house, and the mother and the girl would be his guests in his daughter's house, and that this was as it should be. Mary put the 8th letter down and pressed the flats of both hands against the plank table, and did not move for a long minute. The stove ticked. Outside, Juno blew softly at the rail. The frost was going off the top rail of the corral in a thin steam where the sun had come around the shoulder of the mountain and touched it. He had built the cabin for her. He had built the cabin for her, and for the woman, and for the child, and he had put the deed in her name, because he had meant for her to be the one who opened the door to them, and he had not written her a word of it, because he had not been sure, until the last, that they would come, and he had not wanted her to hope for a family, and be given only a house. She read the 9th letter, and the 10th, and the 11th. They were from the fall of the year just past. They spoke of a delay, of a sickness in the child that had held them at a boarding house in Laramie past the good weather, of a promise from Ruth that they would come as soon as the girl could travel. The 12th was after the first hard snow of that winter, and said he would ride down himself to fetch them in the spring if they had not come by then. The 13th was in the spring, and said he had ridden down to Laramie and found that they had left the boarding house in the fall to try the road north with a family going through, and that no one at the house had heard word since, and that he had gone to the office of the marshal there and put the 2 names on a paper and left a place where he could be written to, and had ridden home. The 14th was a month later and had only 4 lines. No word, roof holds, Ellie's horse waits, keep the fire. Mary read that letter 3 times. The last 3 letters were from the summer and early fall just past. They were shorter. They said he had laid in more wood than one man needed, because a road that had not finished might yet finish. They said he had had a bad turn in his chest at haying, and had gone down to Dock Reeve and been told to rest, and had not rested. They said he had ridden down to Alden Hoke in a snow in November with the deed papers filled out in his own hand, and had asked to have the cabin put in his daughter's name, so that whatever else came, the roof over Ruth and Ellie when they came would be a roof his girl had let them under. The last letter, undated, said only, "If you are reading these, then I did not get to tell you. Tell them for me, Ben." Mary folded the last letter along the crease her father had folded it, and laid it on top of the stack, and put her face down into her hands on the plank table, and wept without sound, with her shoulders shaking under the ash shawl and her forehead pressed against the wood, for a long time, while the stove ticked and Juno shifted at the rail, and the small wooden horse on the pillow of the farther bed kept its burnt match eye on the door. When she was done, she sat up and wiped her face on the sleeve of her wool dress and drew a long, slow breath. She gathered the 17 letters back into their order, tied them once with the white ribbon, and set the bundle back inside the green tin box, and set the tin box back on the mantel beside the cherry box, and hung the silver ring on its twine on the bent nail between them. She stood there a minute with one hand on each box. Then she went to the door and lifted the leather thong and opened it and stepped out into the yard in her mother's boots. The sun had come clear of the ridge. The frost was gone from the top rail of the corral, and the aspen up the slope stood bare and copper. Juno lifted her head from the barrel and looked at her. Mary crossed the trampled grass and put her forehead against the mare's warm cheek and stood so. "He built it for us," she said aloud. And Juno's ear turned toward her once and steadied. "He built it for 3. She stood a long minute with the mare, and then she straightened and looked up the draw toward the black seep where the creek came out of the rock, and past that to the pass, still bare, still open, the road not yet closed by snow. Somewhere south of that pass, if any word of them was true at all, A woman and a girl had started a road and had not finished it, and had gone into a silence her father had listened at for a year and had died still listening. Mary Tanner set her hand on Juno's neck and made a private commitment there in the cold yard under the bright sky, without speaking it, that whatever her father had begun, she would not let end at the door he had built for it. She would keep the fire. She would leave the thong out. She would let the road come to her, as Jeb Ainsley had said at the creek, and if the road did not come, she would in the spring go looking for the road herself. She turned back toward the cabin, and the door stood open, and the fire showed pale gold in the mouth of the stove through the doorway. She went in and closed the door and let the thong hang out through its hole in the wood. The days that followed took a shape. Mary rose before light, laid the fire, fed and watered Juno, split wood at the block behind the shed with her father's axe, carried water from the creek in the covered bucket, swept the floor, and cooked plain food at the stove. She wore the darker of her 2 gray wool dresses through the day and kept the lighter one folded on the near bed for a change. She wore her mother's boots and the ash shawl and left the tin brooch pinned at her throat. She learned the trick of the door that dragged on its sill and the trick of the flue that pulled better with the damper set half open than fully drawn. She learned which of the 3 iron pots heated fastest and which held the heat longest. She learned Juno's ways at the rail and where the mare liked her neck rubbed and where she did not. Twice a day Mary went to the mantel and stood a moment before the 2 boxes and the silver ring on its twine. She did not open the green tin box again. She did not need to. She had read the 17 letters through once and could not now hear the wind in the eaves or the creak of the rope frame under her at night without hearing also her father's cramped pencil sentences under them. Roof holds. Ellie's horse waits. Keep the fire. On the 4th morning, Ord Beeman came up the trail on the roan as he had said he would, with a canvas sack of oats behind his saddle and a smaller sack of cornmeal and a wax paper packet of coffee tied on top. He did not dismount at first. He sat the roan in the yard and looked at the split wood by the block and the swept porch and the smoke going straight up out of the chimney and nodded to himself once. "You've settled," he said. "Some," Mary said. Ord Beeman dismounted then and gave Mary the sacks, and Mary carried them inside and set them on the shelf. He watered the roan at the creek and led it to the corral rail beside Juno and left the 2 horses standing head to tail against the light wind. He came into the cabin at Mary's word and stood inside the door and would not sit. He looked at the mantel and at the 2 boxes and at the ring on its twine and did not ask. Mary told him plain what her father had done and for whom and what the letters had said. Ord Beeman listened with his hat in his hands, and when she was finished, he stood a long time with his eyes on the floorboards. "Amberley," he said at last. "There was an Amberley killed off the Laramie Road 2 winters back. Freight man. I remember the name because Rel had freighted with him one season and did not care for him." "And the woman?" Mary asked. "The child?" "I never heard," Ord Beeman said. "I will listen." He drank a cup of the tea her father had bought and ate a piece of cheese and did not stay past what was decent. Before he left, he stood at the door with the leather thong in his hand and said, without looking at her, that a storm was building west over the pass, that he had seen it from the shoulder coming up, and that she should lay in an extra armful of wood inside the door tonight and check the shed latch and be sure of the corral rope. He said if it came heavy, it would come by tomorrow evening. Mary said she would be ready. Ord Beeman said, "You send Juno down the creek if you need me. She will come to town on her own if you slap her once and tell her the word." "What word?" Mary said. "Home," said Ord Beeman. He put on his hat. He looked once at the mantel and once at Mary's face and mounted the roan and rode out of the yard down into the timber. Mary spent the rest of that day and the whole of the next preparing for weather. She carried in wood until there was a knee-high stack along the wall inside the door and another beside the stove. She filled the covered bucket twice from the creek and set a second bucket beside it, and filled that too, and covered it with a scrap of oilcloth. She checked the shed latch and drove a wedge of pine under it so it would not lift in a wind. She coiled a fresh loop of rope through the corral gate and knotted it twice. She led Juno into the shed at dusk and made a bed of straw for the mare there against the inside wall out of the wind, and left the shed door propped open a hand's width so the mare could see the yard. The storm came in the second evening, as Ord Beeman had said. It came first as a lowering of the light, then as a sudden cold that slid down the draw ahead of the cloud, then as fine dry snow blown sideways out of the west. By full dark the wind was in the eaves, and the fine snow had thickened to a driving fall that whited the window into a soft blank. Mary banked the stove and drew the damper and sat at the plank table with the lamp low and the ash shawl over her shoulders, and listened to the storm find every seam in the roof and every gap in the chinking and hum along the shakes. She did not sleep. She sat up in the near chair through most of the night, with a book of her mother's psalms open on the table, and not read, listening. Once she rose and went to the door, and lifted the thong and opened the door a hand's width against the wind, and looked out, and saw only whirling white and the pale square where the window's light lay across the porch. She closed the door and set the thong. She went to the shed door in the yard, and made sure Juno was standing and steady, and came back inside with snow melting in her hair. Toward the end of the night, when the wind had begun to fall off and only the fine snow still came, Mary heard, above the whisper of it against the logs, a sound that did not belong to weather. It was a thin sound. It came once and stopped. It came again. It was not the wolves. It was not Juno at the shed. It was not the creak of the ridgepole in the cold. She stood in the middle of the room with her hand at her throat, where the tin brooch was, and listened. The sound came a third time, closer, and shaped itself as she listened into a voice, and the voice, thin and dry and past speech, was calling something that was not a word. Mary crossed to the door and lifted the thong and opened the door and stepped onto the porch in her boots and shawl. The wind had dropped enough that she could see across the yard. The snow lay a foot deep on the trampled grass and higher against the corral rails. The pale square of the window light lay out onto the yard and past its edge, where the light thinned to nothing. Something moved. Mary took the lamp from the table and came out onto the porch with it and held it high. The light reached farther. At the edge of the yard, past the corral, a shape was on its knees in the snow, dark against the white, and beside it a smaller shape lay curled and did not move. "Here!" Mary called. She stepped off the porch. "Here! Here!" She crossed the yard in her mother's boots, and the snow came in over the tops of them, and she did not feel it. She reached the shape on its knees, and saw a woman under a soaked wool cloak, with a shawl frozen stiff across her face, and hair coated white, and her arms wrapped around the smaller shape at her side. The woman looked up, and Mary saw eyes that had gone past, knowing what they saw. The woman's lips moved. No sound came. Mary set the lamp down in the snow and put her arm around the woman and lifted. The woman was light. Mary got her onto her feet, and the woman staggered and would have gone down again, and Mary held her. The smaller shape at the woman's side stirred and made a thin cry, and Mary bent and gathered the child up in her free arm. The child was a girl, wrapped in a blanket over a coat and covered in a second blanket over that, and she was not as cold as her mother because her mother had put every extra thing on her. Mary carried the child and half carried the woman across the yard and up onto the porch. She kicked the door open with the toe of her boot and got them inside and pushed the door to with her hip and let the thong fall. She laid the child on the near bed and set the woman in the near chair by the stove and shut the damper wide and threw 2 splits of pine into the firebox, and the fire leapt. The woman was trying to speak. Mary knelt at her knees and unwrapped the frozen shawl from her face and pulled the wet cloak off her shoulders and dropped it in a heap by the door. Under it, the woman wore a dark traveling dress, soaked through at the hem, and a knitted shawl and no coat because the coat was on the child. Her hands, when Mary took them, were the color of tallow and would not close. "Warm," Mary said. "Warm first. Then talk." She unwrapped the child on the near bed. The girl was small, perhaps 5 or perhaps 6, with dark brown hair matted wet against her forehead and a fever spot in each cheek. She opened her eyes once and looked at Mary without fear and closed them again. Mary took off the outer blanket, then the second blanket, then the wet coat, then the little wet stockings and shoes, and rubbed the child's feet between her palms and wrapped her in the dry, pieced calico quilt from the foot of the farther bed, and laid her back down on the near bed nearest the stove. Mary went to the woman and knelt again and rubbed the woman's hands between her own. The woman's eyes came slowly back into focus and found Mary's face and stayed there. "Ben," the woman said. Her voice was a whisper of a whisper. "Ben Tanner." "He is not here," Mary said. She kept her voice level. "I am his daughter." The woman looked at Mary a long time. Something moved behind the tallow of her face, a warmth trying to come. "Mary," she said. "Yes." The woman closed her eyes and tears ran out from under her lids and froze on her lashes, and Mary wiped them away with her thumb. "Ruth Amberley," the woman said, as if giving up a burden she had carried a long way. "My girl, Ellie, she has been sick. We came the Aspen way." Her breath caught. The man said it was shorter. Mary said nothing about the Aspen way. She said instead that Ellie was warm now, that Ruth was warm now, and that there was tea in the pot and broth in the smallest of the 3 iron pots on the back of the stove. She lifted the smallest pot forward, ladled thin bean broth into a tin cup, cooled it against the rim with her breath, and held it to Ruth's mouth a spoonful at a time. Ruth drank slowly. When her hands could close, she took the cup herself and held it in both palms, as if she had forgotten what a cup was for and was learning it again. Ellie stirred once on the near bed and murmured a word that was not quite a word. Mary knelt beside her, laid the back of her hand along the child's cheek, and felt the fever there under the cold skin like a second weather. She dipped a corner of the clean muslin her mother had embroidered with a running vine into cool water from the covered bucket, wrung it, and laid it across Ellie's forehead. She did the same at the throat and at the small wrists. The child sighed and did not wake. Ruth watched from the near chair and could not stop watching. She said, when she could, that Ellie had been on the mend before they left the last house, that the fever had come down for 2 days and then not risen again until the pass, that she had thought they would reach shelter before dark, that she had believed the man on the wagon road when he had pointed at the Aspen slope and said it saved half a day. She said the man had not meant harm. She did not know if he had meant harm or only spoken from the wrong side of his own memory. She said the trail through the Aspen had ended twice, and each time she had turned back and found it again, and each time it had been a little less of a trail than the time before. Mary listened and did not correct and did not question. She fed the fire, changed the muslin at Ellie's forehead, poured a second cup of broth for Ruth, and set a folded blanket behind Ruth's back, so that the near chair would hold her more like a bed. When Ruth's eyes began to close against her will, Mary helped her out of the chair and to the farther bed under the small oil painting of the wheat field. Ruth saw the painting then. She said only, "Oh," in the voice of a woman recognizing a room in a dream. Mary drew the newer soft brown blanket with the cream border up to Ruth's chin and set the untouched pillow beneath her head and did not tell her, that night, whose bed it was and had been. By the time the wind died to a low, steady breath in the eaves, both mother and child were asleep. Mary sat at the plank table in the near chair, in her father's hollow, and did not sleep. She kept the fire even. She wrung the muslin cool and set it again on Ellie's forehead when it warmed. Once, in the deepest part of the night, Ellie began to shiver hard, and Mary lifted the wooden horse from the pillow of the farther bed where she had set it upright to face the door and laid it in the crook of the child's arm under the calico quilt. The shivering eased in a little while. Whether it was the horse or the quilt or the fire, Mary did not know. She thought her father would have said it was the horse. The storm cleared before dawn and left the draw white and still. Snow lay a foot on the trampled grass and higher against the corral rails, and the pines up the slope were pale and heavy and quiet. When first light came, Mary went out into the yard in her boots and shawl and broke a path to the shed and found Juno standing calm at the straw against the inside wall, with frost in her mane and a warm patch of breath on the doorpost where she had leaned. She rubbed the mare's neck and told her the woman and the girl had come. Juno's ear turned to her and turned back. Mary broke a second path to the woodpile, then a third to the creek, where the water still ran black and cold under a lip of new ice. She filled the buckets and carried them in. Ellie's fever broke a little after sunup. It did not go, but it turned, the way a wind turns at daybreak and blows softer from a new quarter. The child opened her eyes, and this time kept them open long enough to look at the roof beams, the stove, the plank table, and finally at Mary sitting on the edge of the bed. "Am I at Mr. Tanner's?" she asked, in a voice like a paper flower. Mary said, "You are." Ellie thought about that. "Is he here?" Mary took the child's hand. "He built this house for you," she said. "He is not here to see you come. I am his girl." Ellie considered this for a long moment with the seriousness only a small sick child can give a thing, and then she nodded once, as if a matter of importance had been settled, and closed her eyes and slept again. Ruth wept quietly under the cream-bordered blanket when she heard it. Mary sat beside her on the edge of the farther bed and held her hand and did not speak. Outside, above the draw, the sky came clear and hard blue. A single raven crossed the yard and went on. That afternoon, Mary put on her mother's boots and the ash shawl and stepped out to the porch and slapped Juno once on the shoulder at the corral rail and said the word, "Home." The mare stood a moment, ears working, then turned of her own accord and picked her way down the broken path toward the creek and the trail beyond. Mary watched until Juno was gone into the timber. Then she went back inside and fed the fire. Ord Beeman came up 2 days later on the roan with Doc Reeve behind him on a stout gray. They had met Juno halfway. Doc Reeve was a small, spare man with round steel spectacles and a bag of black waxed canvas that had been mended at one corner with pale thread. He took off his hat at the door as if entering a church, set his bag on the plank table, and warmed his hands at the stove before he touched the child. Ord Beeman stayed on the porch and did not come in until called. Doc Reeve examined Ellie a long while. He listened to her chest with a wooden tube and looked at her tongue and her eyes and the palms of her hands. He asked Ruth the history of the sickness and listened to the answer without hurrying it and wrote nothing down. When he had finished, he sat on the near chair and folded his spectacles into a small leather sleeve and put them into a pocket over his heart. He looked at Mary. "You did what wanted doing," he said. "Warm, water, broth, quiet. The fever will come and go a day or two yet. Keep her drinking, keep her by the stove." He looked at the wooden horse tucked under the child's arm and did not comment on it. He turned then to Ruth. He said her feet would blister and peel and be new by spring. The frost had not gone deep. He said the fingers would come back. He said she should sleep and eat and let herself be tended for a week and not less. He said it in the same voice he had used to Mary, level, without sentiment. And Ruth received it the same way and said only, "Thank you, doctor." Doc Reeve stayed to a supper of beans and cornbread from Ord Beeman's cornmeal and tea from Ben Tanner's tin. Before he left, he stood at the mantel a long minute, looking at the 2 boxes and the silver ring on its twine hanging between them on the bent nail. He did not touch anything. He turned to Mary and said, in a voice pitched low so as not to reach the beds, "Your daddy asked me last spring if a heart like his could be counted on to see one more winter. I told him no. I told him to bring you up." He paused. "He said he would not have you come to a house that was not ready." Doc Reeve set his hat on his head. "It was ready," he said. "He was right about that." He nodded once at Mary, as if closing a ledger, and went out. Ord Beeman rode down with him. He came back alone the next morning with a coil of rope, a small keg of molasses tied behind the cantle, and a folded newspaper from the Mercantile that no one in the cabin would read. He said the news of Ruth and Ellie's arrival had gone through Pine Hollow, the way news does in a small town in a bad season. from Doc Reeve to Mrs. Sill to the porch of the mercantile, and from there in every direction at once by nightfall. He said Alden Hoke had written down the names Ruth Amberley and Eleanor Amberley in his own book, and had gone through the marshal's papers left with him from Ben Tanner's last ride to Laramie, and found the same names there in Ben Tanner's hand, and had come around to the boarding house in the evening to tell Mrs. Sill that what Ben had been about these 2 years had not been madness after all, and that the town owed him a quiet apology it would never quite know how to make. He said Mrs. Sill had sent up with him a second wedge of cheese, a small paper cone of white sugar for the child, a jar of chicken broth cooled and lidded, and a folded child's nightdress she had cut down that afternoon from one of her own without being asked. He said Mrs. Sill had said not to argue. He said Jeb Ainsley had come off the mountain to town for the first time since summer, stood at the mercantile counter for salt and a spool of black thread, and said to no one in particular that the road had finished. He said no one had asked him what he meant, and no one had needed to. He said Rel Suggett had been on the saloon porch when the word came down with Doc Reeve. He said Rel had listened without speaking and set his coffee cup on the rail and gone back inside and had not been heard laughing about Ben Tanner since. He said that was as close as Rel would come to setting a thing right, and that Mary should take it for what it was. Mary took it for what it was. She thanked Ord Beeman for the news and for the load. She set the cheese and the sugar and the broth and the folded nightdress on the shelf between the flour crock and the tin of coffee, in the place Mrs. Sill's first gifts had gone, and she went to the near bed and put her hand on Ellie's forehead and felt the fever gone down another quarter. That afternoon, while Ruth slept and Ellie dozed with the wooden horse under her chin, Mary stood again at the mantel. She lifted the silver ring off its twine and turned it in the firelight and read, on the inside of the band worn thin by long wearing, in letters so small she had missed them the first time, the word Ruth. She put the ring back on its twine and hung it again on the bent nail between the two boxes, and this time she left the thong of the front door out, as she had promised herself in the yard the morning after the letters, so that anyone who came in from the cold would find the latch would lift. Outside, the sun slid down toward the ridge and turned the snow on the corral rails to a soft rose color, and inside the cabin the fire showed pale gold in the mouth of the stove, and 3 lives that had almost not met breathed evenly under one roof. Winter came in earnest a week after the storm. Snow closed the pass behind Ruth and Ellie's crossing as if a door had been drawn shut, and the trail down to Pine Hollow was open only in weather and shut for days at a time when the wind ran hard from the west. Mary did not mind. The cabin held them. The stove pulled well with the damper half open. The woodpile behind the shed, that a loud man on a saloon porch had called wood enough to roast an ox, proved to be wood enough for 3 through a long winter, split and stacked by a man who had counted the cords twice against a road that might yet come. Ellie's fever left her on the 5th morning. It broke in the small hours with a sweat that soaked the pieced calico quilt through, and Mary changed her into the cut-down nightdress Mrs. Sill had sent, and put dry blankets under her, and hung the quilt over the back of the far chair to dry by the stove. When Ellie woke properly, it was to the smell of cornbread and to Juno's low blow at the corral rail outside, and she asked for water and drank it and asked for more. Ruth wept again, and then did not weep for a long while after. By the 2nd week, Ellie was up in her dark blue wool dress, with the small white collar, sitting on a folded blanket on the near bed, playing quietly on the pegged floor with the wooden horse and a row of pine cones set as a herd. The little brown leather shoes fit her, though only just, and Mary watched her scuff them once on the plank, and then look up guiltily, and Mary smiled and said nothing, because a pair of shoes bought for a girl who had come was a pair of shoes meant to be scuffed. The knitted cap the color of buttermilk sat on the peg by the door beside Mary's ash shawl and Ruth's mended cloak. The woolen stockings on the shelf, sheep gray with the small cream band at the top, Mary took down at last and gave to Ruth, who put them on and stood a moment in her stocking feet on the pegged floor and pressed her hand to her mouth. Ruth mended. Her hands closed again. Her feet blistered as Doc Reeve had said they would, and peeled, and were new. She was quiet the first days, and then less quiet, and by the third week she was up before Mary in the mornings, feeding the stove with a light hand and setting the kettle on. She had a plain low voice, and used it sparingly. She had been schooled well as a girl and could read anything set before her, and in the long evenings by the lamp she read aloud from Mary's mother's book of Psalms, and Ellie fell asleep to her mother's voice for the first time in a year. They spoke of Ben Tanner without hurry. Ruth had met him once in a Cheyenne mercantile the summer she was widowed, when she had gone in to sell a good bridle for less than it was worth, and he had stood behind her in the line and given the storekeeper a look. He had bought the bridle at her price, given it back to her at the door, and told her to keep it against a bad month. That had been all. His notice about the north pasture had come to her afterward, through a woman she cleaned rooms for, and she had written him a letter that took her 3 days to write and a week to send. She had never seen the ranch and had never seen Pine Hollow, and she had never seen him again. She had written him twice from Laramie in the fall of the last year, to say that Ellie had a cough, and once more to say that Ellie's cough had gone into her chest, and after that she had not written because she had not known what to say to a man building a house for a woman whose child might not live to walk into it. Ellie had lived. The family going through had left in a hurry and had not been the kind to wait, and the man on the wagon road had pointed at the aspen slope, and Ruth had taken the aspen slope because a small girl on a mule cannot sit a long day. Mary did not tell Ruth what her father had written in the 14th letter. She read it to herself once more in private, in the near chair with the lamp low, and folded it back into the ribbon with the others, and put the tin box back on the mantel. Some things a daughter keeps for a father who cannot keep them for himself. Ord Beeman came up every week, the trail allowed, on the roan, with oats and cornmeal and news. He brought word from Alden Hoke that the papers on Ruth Amberley's widow's claim in Laramie were in hand at last, and that a small sum from her dead husband's freight share, held 2 years by a company that had not known where to send it, would be waiting for her at the bank in Cheyenne come spring. He brought word from Mrs. Sill that a room at the boarding house would be kept for any of them, any time, no charge, and not to argue. He brought word from Doc Reeve that Ellie's chest sounded clean when he thought of her, which was often. And he brought word once, in the 4th week, that Rel Suggett had come by the freight yard office to Alden Hoke and asked, quietly, and with his hat in his hand, whether there was any small thing a man might do for the Amberley woman and her girl by way of a start. Alden had told him a load of good hay laid by at the livery for Juneau through the winter would be a start, and Rel had sent the hay the next morning and had not asked for thanks, and had not been thanked. Jeb Ainsley came up once, on foot, in a thaw, with his peeled pine staff and his oilcloth bundle, and stood in the yard, and would not come in. Mary went out to him in her shawl. He looked at the smoke going straight up out of the chimney and at Juneau at the rail and at the leather thong hanging out of the door, and he nodded once. He said, "The road come." Mary said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Keep the fire." Mary said, "I mean to." He turned and walked back down the draw the way he had come, and Mary stood in the yard until he was small among the pines and then gone. The winter passed as winters do in that country, long, white, silent for stretches, loud in the eaves for stretches, and full at its middle of small evenings that were not remarkable and would be remembered. Ellie learned to knead bread standing on a wooden crate at the plank table with flour to her elbows. Ruth learned the trick of the dragging door and the flue. Mary learned that a house built for 3 fits, 3 the way a coat cut for a shoulder fits the shoulder, and that her father had measured well. The second bed under the wheat field painting was Ruth and Ellie's, and the small calico quilt at its foot went over Ellie every night, and the wooden horse slept in the crook of Ellie's arm, and by day stood on the mantel between the 2 boxes where Mary had moved him so he could watch the door. The M&T cut shallow into the header log stayed as it was. Mary thought of it sometimes, going in and out under it, and did not tell Ruth what it stood for. It was enough that a house deeded to a daughter had opened its door to a mother and a child. The letters, cut by a man with a chisel in a cold November, before he knew whether any of the 3 would come, had been true either way. Spring came slowly to Wheat Ear Draw. The snow softened first at the south edge of the yard where the sun stood longest, then along the corral rails, then in patches up the aspen slope where the trees were bare and copper still and had not yet greened. The creek rose. The black seep at the head of the draw ran fuller and clearer. One morning in the last week of what Mary would afterward call a good winter, Ellie ran out into the yard in her scuffed brown shoes without her cap and stood in a bare patch of last year's grass and looked up at a sky the color of watered milk and laughed once, a small clean sound Mary had not heard before out of any child. Ruth came to the door in her stockinged feet and stood beside Mary and put her hand on Mary's arm and did not speak. That afternoon a rider came up the draw. It was Ord Beeman on the roan, with Alden Hoke behind him on a chestnut mare, and behind them a small light wagon driven by a boy from the livery, empty except for a milk cow tied at the tail, a red heifer with a white face and a calm eye. Alden Hoke had brought the deed papers back for a last endorsement so that Ruth Amberley's name and Eleanor Amberley's name went on to the deed beside Mary Tanner's, at Mary's request, as tenants in common of the cabin at the head of Wheat Ear Draw, free and clear. Ruth did not know Mary had written the request. Ruth stood on the porch with the papers in her hand and read them again and said, "Miss Tanner, this is too much." Mary said, "It was always for 3. Ruth signed where Alden Hoke pointed, once at the bottom and once beside a pencil mark on the second page, and Alden blotted the ink with a scrap of blotter he carried in his coat, and folded the papers into a leather sleeve, and gave the sleeve to Ruth. The red heifer was from Rel Sugget. There was no note with her and no message. Ord Beeman said only that Rel had asked the boy at the livery to say she was gentle and would give milk through the summer, and that her name, if they wanted one, was up to the girl. Ellie named her Rose, because the snow on the corral rails at sunset that first evening had been a soft rose color, and Rose she was for as long as she lived. They stood together in the yard, the 5 of them and Rose and Juno at the rail. And Alden Hoke took off his hat and looked at the cabin, and at the smoke going straight up and at the M&T on the header log. And he said, "Your daddy would be glad, Miss Mary." Mary said, "He is." She said it quietly and without drama, and Alden Hoke nodded, and Ord Beeman looked down at his boots, and the boy from the livery took his hat off too because the men had. The sun was down on the ridge by the time they left. Mary and Ruth and Ellie stood on the porch and watched the small party go down the draw at a walk. 3 riders and a wagon, and the sound of hooves on soft ground, until they were gone into the timber and the timber was still. The light on the aspen slope turned the color of old honey. The light on the creek turned the color of coin. The light on the roof of the cabin, silver with weather, turned the color of a wheat field in late summer, exactly like the sky in the small oil painting above the far bed with the word home in the corner in small brown letters. Ellie went in first, to feed a splinter of pine to the stove, because it was her chore now. Ruth went in next, to set the kettle on. Mary stood a moment longer on the porch alone. She put her hand on the header log above the door and touched the shallow M&T with her fingertips. She looked at Juno at the rail, and at Rose beyond her, and at the yard trampled with the tracks of 3 sets of boots and 1 small set, and at the leather thong hanging out of the hole in the door where it had hung all winter for anyone who might come in from the cold. She said quietly to no one, and to the ridge and to her father wherever he was listening, "He didn't leave me a cabin. He left me a family to keep." Then she lifted the latch by the thong and went inside, and the door closed behind her on its dragging sill. And pale gold firelight showed a long moment in the seam under the door before that, too, settled into the dusk. Above the cabin the first star came out over Wheat Ear Draw. The chimney smoke went straight up into a sky the color of watered milk fading to blue. Inside, 3 voices moved gently around a plank table set for 3, and a small girl laughed once more, and a mother laughed with her, and a young woman in a plain wool dress with a tin brooch at her throat poured tea from a tin her father had bought against a road he had not lived to see finish. "Thank you for staying with Mary to the end of this quiet road." If a house built for someone who never came, and the girl who kept its fire until they did, warmed something in you, leave a like, a comment telling us where you are watching from tonight, and subscribe so the next story finds you by the stove. Ride easy, there is another lantern waiting up the trail.